Mother weeps. She is alone. Having lost her husband some time before today, she has lost her only child, a son. As she walks through the city gates to bury the dead outside the place of the living surround her in a great crowd. They will do what they can to carry her in her grief, just as they carry the open coffin holding her son before them. But what life will she return to at the end of the day, when 2/3 of her family are now in the grave? This could be any day, any year, really any country in the world. It's a human story. Yet in the midst of this tragic but everyday story of loss and grief, on this one particular day, a man walked into the scene with great compassion, unlike that of any others, because he had compassion, but he also had power. And so he tells the widow, "Do not weep." It would almost seem callous and insensitive to say to somebody. It's not something I would recommend that you say when you go to a funeral or a wake. Don't cry. Cry. Feel the pain. Grieve. How could she even receive such a word if it were not for the gentle assurance and the power in the voice of the speaker? For there was never a time more suited to tears. But what is the meaning of this command? The Gospel says he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. Then fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people." When I was a child and I first heard this story, I could only think of it in the simple terms of the grief and the loss of a mother for her child, the love of a mother for her only son. And that is, of course, the heart of the story, and it remains so even after all this time. But with the years, and as a father who will care for his own family, I think now and more in terms of the adult, in terms of fear, security, of all the things that grown-ups have to think about. For this young man who had died was in fact his mother's only security in this world, in a world that offers little compassion and little shelter. And yes, the good people of the town of Nain helped her that day and surrounded her that day and gave their condolences that day, but for how long would that support last, and how tangible would it really be? Who would take care of a widow for years to come? What resources did she have left? Was she prepared for the challenges ahead? The Gospel does not give us any of those details, but history suggests to us that it was an inevitable road of poverty for a woman in her position. And even in Jewish society, her fate was not secure, even though the care of one's parents was mandated by the Torah and is expected of all of us through the 5th commandment. Honor thy father and thy mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. To honor your father and mother when you're a child, yes, means pay them respect, don't disobey, etc., etc. You all know that. When you're an adult and you have aging parents and widows or widowers, honoring means something very tangible and very real. It means taking personal responsibility for their care and their safety, without which all the politeness of childhood means very little. Without a son to provide for the widow, there were few in society that would take on such a burden readily. There were already in that time many people who refused to take on the burden of their own parents. Jesus, in fact, criticized them very roundly as the hypocrites of his day for seeking to find religious and pious excuses for avoiding such responsibilities. In Matthew 15, we read that he chastises them. He says, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition?" The tradition of the elders, not the tradition of God. "For God commanded, saying, Honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, Whoever says to his father or mother, Whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift to God, then he need not honor his father or mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition." So apparently, the legal tradition of the Pharisees had developed a clever loophole for avoiding responsibility towards parents. One could effectively declare their assets, the accumulated value of their gifts and labors, this is what we've been talking about, as set aside for God as a religious or charitable gift to be held in escrow, while still maintaining the resources for themselves under the guise of a trust. Okay? So it's sort of like setting up a foundation in your own name as a tax shelter in which you still have complete control of the funds, but don't do actually any charitable work. If you have any doubt if such a foundation does that work or not, you can look up charitynavigator.org, which is the same organization which assesses our international Orthodox Christian charities, and see what they have to say. Don't listen to me, listen to the professionals. In any case, it was shady back then, just as it's shady today. But the New Testament church was not also free of its scalawags. As the church grew and those who joined her learned of the compassion and the charity of the followers of the way, they sometimes tried to take advantage of this charitable giving. St. Paul, in fact, offers Timothy a frank solution to this problem, which was growing rampant in the community, and it had to do with widows. He writes to his godson, "Honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents. For this is good and acceptable before God." This is the essence of the fifth commandment. "Now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command that they may be blameless." So test even the widows who come for charity to make sure that they are not being neglected. If you enable a neglector, you are not doing a good thing. And then he writes very importantly, "But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." He has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. He then goes on to say, "Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works. If she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows." So even the church is called to have limits on its charitable giving and generosity. Because enabling those who are not fulfilling their responsibility is being like an accomplice to it. We have a fiduciary duty. And that is just a fancy word for saying we have a moral obligation to make sure that people in community are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And this effectively created what's called the Order of Widows, because it became almost a special community of women who were dedicated in their widowhood to this life of good works. So even though they were supported by the church, they worked very hard in their widowhood and they made a really positive impact and difference in the community. And later, combined with those women who dedicated themselves to virginity, the virgins, which St. Paul also talks about elsewhere, this became the stream out of which is born women's monastic life, which really preceded men's monastic life. Wherever you see the foundation of monasteries, you almost always find the foundation of women's communities first. St. Anthony is no different. The first great hermit saint first had a sister who entered into a convent before. So it's an important part of the life of the church throughout its history. Now, charity was offered, of course, and they did receive for their basic needs. But with it, just as God's gifts to us comes with responsibility to manage them wisely, to labor them, to multiply them for the glory of God and for the benefit of the world, so to even these type of arrangements, there was this responsibility on the women who received them, so that the charity would not be abused or taken advantage of. The question we could ask ourselves, and we may be asking ourselves, is that's all very nice, it sounds great, but would I really want my own family member to be pushed into that position out of necessity? Ideally, that's the kind of position that comes upon a person out of their own free will, because they want to dedicate themselves, not because they have no other options. Which brings us back to that very important principle that St. Paul establishes. If anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those in his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now, we were told last week in the Gospel, also St. Luke, that it is no credit, no thanks to a Christian if he does good to those who will do good to him, if he loves those who love him, right? Because even sinners do the same. And that's true. That's why not taking care of our own family makes us actually worse than an unbeliever, because even the unbelievers do the same. Unfortunately, many of us may find ourselves making such poor decisions in our life financially that we may end up not being able to take care of our families the way we should. And it's probably unintentional, and we may not even realize that we are doing it right now. Before you think that this is something far removed from your life or your family and your acquaintances, consider this. According to a recent study, 56% of Americans said they have less than $1,000 in their checking and savings accounts combined. They are living paycheck to paycheck effectively. Nearly a quarter have less than $100 to their name. Meanwhile, 38% said they would pay less than their full credit card balance this month, and 11% said they would make the minimum payment, meaning they would likely be mired in debt for years and pay more in interest than they originally intended. And if you have your credit card bill, you see the little box that says if you only make the minimum payment, this is what you'll end up paying, how long it will take. And it's always an exorbitantly greater amount than what you originally did. It paints a daunting picture for the average American coming out of the spend-heavy holiday season, steeped in credit card debt, living paycheck to paycheck, at serious risk of financial ruin if the slightest thing goes wrong. The slightest thing. An accident, an illness, a death, a divorce, a power outage. Just take into account holiday spending. It's right around the corner. Some of you are dreading it. Some of you go at it with gusto. Some of you have already started. The same report shows that 2/3 of shoppers spent without having any plan, or if they did have a plan, they didn't follow it at all. They went beyond it. And out of those people that overspent or completely went without planning, 85% of them said they had no regrets. And out of those, a certain percentage even said they wish they had spent more. Brothers and sisters, this is a massive problem in our country today. It is one of the most important problems, and it's the thing that nobody wants to talk about. It has to do with not living in contentment, giving into covetousness, not practicing godliness. All these things we've been talking about. It has a very real world application. The end result is that we are putting ourselves into a position of major risk of not being able to take care of our own households. So we say that we are believers, but our checkbooks reveal that very often we are actually behaving worse than unbelievers. And I don't say this to judge you, because I found myself in a similar position. When my father died, I discovered how close I was to that line. And all of a sudden expenditures, and all of a sudden debt, and all of a sudden crisis. And it was talk about the ice water challenge. Okay? It was a wake-up call. Many of us are in this position, and we don't want to be. We didn't mean to be. But you know, we didn't really know any better. No one had ever preached this to us, and no one ever taught us, but man, those credit card companies always seem to be advertising. Now, we don't know if the widow of Nain was in any kind of position to do well after the loss of her husband or her son, but the fact that Jesus showed this unique and special visitation upon her suggests that she was not. She had no son to take care of her to fulfill the fifth commandment. So Jesus stepped in for that one moment and served, in effect, as her son at that moment, and took care of her by returning to her her own son. Perhaps because one day he would be in a position of needing someone to come and take care of his own mother. A dark day, a day in which the sun would hide its rays for shame of what was happening on the earth. In John 19 we read, "Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus therefore saw his mother, and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, 'Woman, behold your son.' And then he said to the disciple, 'Behold your mother.' And from that hour the disciple took her to his own home." The disciple, which tradition identifies as John himself, became the son for the widow who had lost her only child, Jesus. He who poured out everything he had, blood and water, for us and for our salvation, on that day could not even provide for his own and needed help from somebody else. So let us pursue in humility then godliness with contentment, living a wiser, more careful lifestyle. Let us be able to say at the end of our lives that we have fulfilled the proverb, "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children." We cannot do this by living beyond our means, accumulating more and more debt. One small crisis, one cross away from ruin, bankruptcy, poverty. In fact, as a nation, we are putting our children's children in a position of having to pay for our unrighteousness, our wickedness. Let us not think that we are so deserving as the widow of Nain that we will have some special miracle visitation. We brought such calamity on ourselves. And we would be foolish to expect the Lord to come upon us and bail us out of our mistakes. We are, none of us, too big to fail. We will reap what we have sown. Brothers and sisters, on this Sunday we continued for a fifth week a series on how to handle God's blessing and gifts by considering the fifth commandment as a guide to wise management and responsible living. Let us each pray and work so that God will give us the time we need to build an inheritance of wisdom and discernment and righteousness for generations to come. For the prayers of our Holy Fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Christ is among us.